Every woman who married into the Kennedy family paid a price. Some paid with their privacy, some with their identity, some with their mental health, and almost all of them paid with the same thing, their silence. This isn't really a story about America's most famous political dynasty. It's a story about the women who held it together, what it cost them, and what they were never allowed to say about it. Carolyn Bessette realized she was in over her head on her very first night at the Kennedy dinner table. The sun was dipping below Nantucket Sound when Carolyn Bessette took her seat at the long table in Ethel Kennedy's dining room. Around her, tan, athletic cousins with an abundance of hair and an unspoken language she hadn't been given the key to. The seat at the head of the table remained tellingly vacant until a 66-year-old Ethel Kennedy made her entrance, and the whole table scrambled to its feet. Carolyn, half a beat behind, scrambled too. Ethel worked the table like a prosecutor. The OJ trial, the potential invasion of Haiti, before those intense brown eyes settled on Carolyn. So, do you think a federal assault weapons ban will impact crime in our country, dear? Carolyn's signature self-confidence evaporated. I'm sure it will. The question mark at the end of her answer cost her. Then, Ethel's gaze dropped to the Bergdorf scarf knotted at Carolyn's throat, the one she'd bought specifically for the occasion, because much like the mother-in-law she never got to meet, Carolyn believed in the power of accessorizing. Ethel remarked that it looked a little warm. Under the table, Carolyn's boyfriend John F. Kennedy Jr. squeezed her hand. There was nothing else he could do. Carolyn hastened to remove the scarf as the whole table watched. That night, she called her best friend and said she was never going back. She did, of course. 3 years later, she married John at a secret ceremony on a Georgia island. But what she couldn't have known yet, sitting at that table with the scarf in her lap, is that the humiliation wasn't a glitch in the Kennedy onboarding process. It was the Kennedy onboarding process, and it had been running that way for decades. Because here's the thing about the Kennedy myth. It works the same way as the British royal family myth works, and for a lot of the same reasons. The fantasy of a regular woman marrying into American royalty has been glamorized and idealized to the max. As recently as 2012, even Taylor Swift was so swept up in it that after just a few weeks of dating RFK Jr.'s son Connor, she bought a house directly across from the family compound in Hyannisport. But just like with the British royals, reality wasn't all glamorous yachts and beautiful clothes. The women who married in were expected to silently absorb generational systemic infidelity while surrendering their own identities to their husbands' political careers. They were placed under immense public scrutiny, pressure to suppress their emotions inside a family culture so competitive and at times so violent that bullying was simply the norm, and those who couldn't keep up were unceremoniously left behind. The inner dynamics of this family touched everyone who married into it. But as usual, and I mean that quite literally as a pattern so consistent it borders on policy, the women got the shorter end of that deal. Welcome to Too Lady to Rest. Joseph Kennedy Sr., JFK's father, usually gets most of the credit/blame for what this family became, but the blueprint actually existed before him. His father, PJ Kennedy, consciously rejected the drinking and brawling ways of his fellow Irish dock workers. He became a saloon owner, then a liquor importer, then a quiet political boss who traded in favors rather than speeches, accumulating power slowly, almost secretly, as if he already understood that the real payoff wouldn't come for several generations. On the other side of the family, JFK's maternal grandfather, John Honey Fitzgerald, after whom Jack would later rename the presidential yacht, was a different kind of operator entirely. With relentless energy and a genius for compartmentalization, Honey Fitz had an almost supernatural ability to project a perfect family image while quietly facing corruption charges behind the scenes. Despite their contrasting styles, the underlying logic of both of JFK's grandfathers was pretty similar. Win at all costs and make it look good. Joe Sr. took that blueprint and ran with it. He didn't just tolerate physical fights between his sons, he actively encouraged them, making his preference for his eldest son, Joseph Jr., so obvious that the other children were expected to show their older brother almost the same deference they showed their father. And failure, be it athletic, academic, really any kind, was met with a cold displeasure that, in a household like this, was somehow worse than shouting. His parenting philosophy, delivered regularly and without irony at the dinner table, was, "We want no losers around here, only winners." That dinner table, by the way, was not the warm family gathering you might picture. Alongside his wife Rose, Joe Sr. quizzed their children on current events from around age 6, expecting not just answers but confident, informed arguments. Unsuspecting guests would sit in quiet terror, praying no one called on them, watching the Kennedy kids volley opinions at each other like it was a contact sport. Speaking of, if you've heard anything about the Kennedys beyond the tragedies and the scandals, you've probably heard about their infamous touch football games. It sounds charming, right? This big, boisterous family out on the lawn on a Sunday afternoon, America's royalty playing a wholesome American game. But every single person who ever played in one of those games describes it the same way. Not as a game, but as something closer to a battlefield. Over-the-top tackles, pile-ons, shoving matches. Family rivalries played out in real time on a patch of grass, with the social stakes of a job interview. For outsiders marrying in, it functioned as a hazing ritual. Pass, and you might earn a grudging kind of respect. Refuse to play, and you'd spend years trying to claw back the ground you'd lost. Jackie Kennedy genuinely tried. She threw herself in, despite, by her own admission, having no idea where to run if she caught the ball. Which honestly, same. For her trouble, she got her ankle broken. And as she sat on the grass, weeping in pain, the Kennedy family stood around her in collective disbelief before they started laughing. The only person who ran over was Ethel, Robert Kennedy's wife, who turned to the others and snapped, "Don't be so mean. She's getting better at the game." Jackie never played again. She didn't need that lesson twice. Decades later, Carolyn Bessette had a similar experience. Someone threw her a football, and on instinct, she ducked. Again, same. As it sailed clean over her head, John's cousin Kara said dryly, "See, now the goal is to actually catch the ball." But Carolyn was not laughing. She was starting to understand something that no one had warned her about. That fitting into the Kennedy family wasn't going to just take work. It was going to take a willingness to subordinate herself completely. Her preferences, her personality, her pace, all of it had to be surrendered to the rhythm of a family that had no interest in slowing down for her. Because the family was more important than any individual in it. With one exception, of course, the men. The men's political careers were the whole point, the organizing principle around which everything else was arranged, which meant everyone else was expected to sacrifice their time, their energy, their personal ambitions, and at times their bodily autonomy for the cause. The Kennedy children were raised to believe this was love. Joe Sr. preached it at every meal and in every letter he sent home from his business trips. Kennedys stick together, the family against the world. And they did, often at considerable personal cost. But the rule was to never show it. It was Jack and his sister Kik who, as children, put the whole mandate into words. Kennedys don't cry. We'll come back to that. But even if you survived the football games and held your own at the dinner table, in this family, the house still always won. Because there was another price of admission that nobody was warned about. The person that you'd been before, or that you wanted to be, was never quite the person that the family needed you to be. Jackie figured this out faster than most. Her broken ankle was an early lesson in the futility of pretending to be something she wasn't. She had almost nothing in common with her Kennedy sisters-in-law, who derisively called her the Deb, as in debutante, and regarded her sophistication with open bafflement as she arrived on boat trips with quiche and white wine, while everyone else brought peanut butter sandwiches. Behind their backs, Jackie was equally unimpressed, privately referring to them as wild animals. She eventually concluded that her best strategy wasn't assimilation, but differentiation. Lean into being the odd one out and play to her strengths. She showered flattery on Rose while gravitating toward Joe Sr. for intellectual conversation. He, in turn, absolutely adored her. But even that wasn't enough to make the family see her as a full human being, rather than a political asset. She would overhear Joe and his sons discussing her in exactly those terms. Quote, "They spoke of me as if I weren't a person, just a thing, just a sort of asset, like Rhode Island." End quote. For Joan Bennett, Ted Kennedy's wife, Jackie's refusal to disappear into the background was something close to a lifeline. Joan was gentle and deeply sensitive, which made her almost constitutionally ill-suited for life inside this family. Her marriage hadn't exactly been her idea. Ted, following in Jack's footsteps as a committed playboy, had no interest in settling down and had to be pressured into the engagement by Joe Sr., with both bride and groom reportedly having doubts right up to the ceremony. Jack, for his part, was quietly recorded giving his youngest brother a pre-wedding talk about what marriage actually meant for a Kennedy man. We'll get to that in a moment. She eventually developed an alcohol addiction, which became the family's preferred explanation for her unhappiness, conveniently redirecting attention away from its actual source. Whenever Ted made jokes about her drinking in front of everyone, which tended to happen precisely when she raised anything related to his infidelity, it was usually Jackie, and sometimes Ethel too, who quietly pulled her aside afterward. But however much the women supported each other, there was one arena where they were still expected to compete, and where none of them had any real control: their fertility. As devout, image-conscious Catholics, the Kennedys placed enormous weight on having a large family. Ethel set the standard, producing nearly a child a year and cementing herself as the family ideal in the process. Jackie and Joan, who suffered through miscarriages and stillbirths, were left to absorb their grief while quietly managing the sense that they'd somehow failed. And for Jackie, at least, there was a particularly cruel dimension to it. Many of her fertility problems are thought to have stemmed from venereal disease infections she caught from Jack, who had chronic chlamydia from constant reinfection. Which brings us to one of the Kennedy family's defining creeds: boys play while girls pray. The most toxic legacy Joseph Kennedy Sr. left his family wasn't ambition or ruthlessness, it was his attitude toward women. Joe viewed them as simply another luxury available to a rich man, and he made absolutely no secret of it. He explicitly encouraged his sons to have sex as often as possible, establishing infidelity not just as acceptable behavior, but as the Kennedy golden standard of masculinity, adopted by his sons and sons-in-law alike. Most men of the era at least tried to be discreet. The Kennedy men didn't bother. Infidelity was treated as a shared family endeavor, reckless, open, almost collaborative, and the Kennedy sisters were conditioned their whole lives to cover for their father and brothers as a matter of course. In the 1920s, Joe discovered Hollywood and became immediately fascinated, though probably not for the reasons he advertised. He invested heavily in the industry, eventually even purchasing his own studio, drawn as much by the easy access to beautiful women as by the money-making potential of manufacturing glamour for mass consumption, which, when you think about it, was something he was already doing at home in a way. His most prominent Hollywood relationship was with actress Gloria Swanson, his long-term mistress, whom he brought openly into the family home and paraded before guests and family members without a trace of embarrassment. Rose's response to this was to simply not react at all. She ignored it completely, pretended it wasn't happening, even as Joe seated his girlfriends at her dinner table. It set the tone for the entire family, and it baffled everyone who witnessed it. Betty Spaulding, wife of JFK's friend Chuck Spaulding, recalled her disbelief years later. "That old man, having his mistresses there at the house for lunch and supper? I couldn't understand it. It was unheard of." But Rose hadn't always been this way. In 1930, heavily pregnant with her fourth child, she finally broke and left Joe, seeking refuge at her father's house. Instead of protecting her, Honey Fitz sent her straight back, but not without first arranging a Catholic retreat, from which Rose returned with a renewed religious conviction that seemed to give her a framework for enduring a situation she seemed to have no ability to change. She never tried to leave again. It was as if she realized that the only way to survive the situation was to be, in some essential way, no longer fully present in it. We'll come back to that. Joe Sr. had established not just a standard of infidelity, but an entire culture of compartmentalization around it. Everyone in the family was trained to take the men's promiscuity in stride, to maintain the collective pretense that nothing was happening, that everything was fine, that the image and the reality were somehow the same thing. Jack Kennedy frequently abandoned Jackie at social events to slip away with another woman, leaving guests to stand around making conversation while everyone pretended not to know exactly where he'd gone. He was often only a few rooms away. Robert Kennedy, despite being the most devoutly Catholic of all the brothers, allegedly did the same to Ethel, particularly at the parties organized by their brother-in-law, actor Peter Lawford. Lawford, married to Patricia Kennedy, served as the designated liaison between the Kennedy brothers and the Hollywood world, and more specifically, as their fixer. As a member of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack, alongside Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., he had access to a world that embodied everything the Kennedy brothers wanted when off the clock. Cool, glamorous, and consequence-free. The Lawford Santa Monica Beach House functioned as a kind of unofficial Western White House, a base for the brothers' California activities, and the setting for some of the most storied dinner parties of the era, which hosted stars like Lauren Bacall, Natalie Wood, Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, whose nickname for Peter was Brother in Lawford, and of course, Marilyn Monroe. But when Pat was away, the parties Peter threw in her absence were a different affair entirely. Jean Martin, Dean Martin's ex-wife, described watching Lawford operate in real time. Quote, "I saw Peter in the role of pimp for Jack Kennedy. It was a nasty business. They were just too gleeful about it, not discreet at all. Of course, there was nothing discreet about either of the Kennedys, Bob or Jack. It was like high school time, very sophomoric. The things that went on in that beach house were just mind-boggling." End quote. Their next-door neighbor was more succinct. "Like a goddamn whorehouse." It was in this environment that both Kennedy brothers allegedly became involved with Marilyn Monroe at different times, and the rumors by this point were circulating well beyond their inner circle. When Sinatra's rumored mob ties became a political liability, JFK quietly dropped him in favor of the more respectable Bing Crosby. Sinatra was reportedly furious and took it out on Lawford, blacklisting him from Hollywood and effectively ending his career. Marilyn Monroe's death hit Lawford hard, for reasons connected to the Kennedy brothers that are outside the scope of this video. He fell into alcoholism and never really recovered. Some prices, it turns out, were paid by everyone in their orbit, not just the women. Jackie's response to all of it followed the same playbook as Rose's: make yourself scarce and try to avoid being visibly humiliated, which explains her conspicuous absence from the 1962 Madison Square Garden Gala for the president's birthday, the night Marilyn Monroe famously delivered her breathy rendition of Happy Birthday. Jackie had known about the performance in advance and decided it was simply more than she was willing to sit through. Instead, she took Caroline to a horse show in Glenora, reportedly telling her sister Lee that life was too short to worry about Marilyn Monroe. When Jack joined her at Glenora afterward, she made her position clear: stop seeing Marilyn, or Jackie would divorce him and take his political career down with her. It was her most powerful bargaining chip, essentially her only one, and it worked. She knew exactly what it was worth, because she'd used it once before. In 1956, 7 months pregnant, Jackie campaigned for Jack at the Democratic National Convention. The moment it was over, Jack rejected her pleas for him to stay and left for a yacht in the Mediterranean, where he met up with his brother Ted and several of his buddies. While he was partying at sea, she suffered a severe hemorrhage and delivered a stillborn daughter alone. When someone finally reached him by phone, Jack saw no reason to cut his trip short. He told Bobby that what was done was done. The baby was lost anyway. And he actually stayed on the yacht until he was told in explicit terms that abandoning his grieving wife was going to harm his presidential ambitions. Jackie's mother, Janet, appealed directly to Rose Kennedy, who had once made a point of how much she cared for Jackie. Rose said only that she was sure Jack knew what he was doing. Let's put another pin on that, shall we? Jackie saw no other option. She threatened divorce. She knew exactly what she was worth to the family's political project, and Joe Kennedy Sr. knew that she knew. He responded by offering $1 million trust fund, and the subject was closed. However hard Jackie tried to sidestep it, the threat of public exposure was constant, and it wasn't only about the affairs. In November 1960, minutes after the birth of John F. Kennedy Jr., an Associated Press photographer snuck into Jackie's hospital room at Georgetown University and jumped out of a closet, flash blazing, as she was being wheeled into the room. Secret Service agents caught him and exposed the film before the photos could be used. It was a preview of what the rest of her life would look like. After JFK's assassination, she pursued lengthy lawsuits against paparazzo Ron Galella, who literally stalked her around the world for years. The struggles of Joan Kennedy were handled by the press with even less mercy. In 1963, the Boston Globe covered her first miscarriage by placing it in direct comparison with the then successful pregnancies of her sisters-in-law. Ethel would go on to deliver baby Christopher on the 4th of July, while Jackie's baby, Patrick, would be born in August, but would go on to die several hours after birth. By the 1970s, tabloids had settled on a simpler narrative. Joan was the family drunk. The lowest point came in 1976, when two fellow patients at her rehab center sold her group therapy confessions to the National Enquirer. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, arriving into the Kennedy world in the 1990s, faced a newer and in some ways more visceral version of that scrutiny. Paparazzi swarmed her every time she left her apartment, sometimes dozens of them, and the tactics were deliberately cruel. Photographers would shout insults directly into her face, knowing that photos of her looking angry or distressed commanded higher prices than photos of her looking fine. They even followed her to her gynecologist's office and used the images to construct random narratives about fertility problems. The cumulative effect was a slow erosion. Carolyn began to withdraw, describing herself as feeling like a caged animal, convinced that any unguarded moment would be weaponized to cast her as the villain of the Kennedy story. That paranoia seeped into her relationship with John, feeding a volatility that eventually played out in public, most notoriously in a paparazzi video of the two of them fighting in the street. I actually covered that in a separate video if you want the full picture. What made Carolyn's situation especially difficult was that she was in almost every way a completely wrong fit for the role of a Kennedy wife. She was a modern woman who had no interest in performing submission. But even beyond that, and this was maybe the more fundamental problem, she wore her emotions on her sleeve. And for a family whose entire structure depended on concealment, that made her dangerous. Which brings us to the final and most devastating price of all. In this family, you were not allowed to have emotions, and you were absolutely forbidden from processing them. The roots of it went back to their immigrant origins. The Kennedys believed that people as fortunate as they were had no business complaining about adversity. Any adversity. Suffering was to be borne stoically and privately. As we saw with Jackie's broken ankle, even physical pain was considered an embarrassment, and the standard applied to children just as ruthlessly as it did to adults. Crying was cowardice. Weakness was considered shameful. This is why most of the public had no idea how serious JFK's health problems actually were until long after his death. Due to a lifelong back injury, JFK was in significant pain nearly every day of his presidency and had been conditioned since childhood to act as though nothing was wrong. When you consider that, I feel like his speculated sex addiction almost starts to make sense. But this went beyond keeping up appearances for the outside world. Even within the family, showing that you weren't coping, that something was getting to you, was its own kind of transgression. Nowhere was this more suffocating than around the subject of the man's infidelity. The whole system depended on collective denial, a shared agreement of sorts to sustain this illusory reality. And anyone who visibly cracked under the weight of it threatened to bring the whole thing down. The men were the obvious beneficiaries, and they contributed their share of gaslighting. But the person most responsible for modeling and enforcing the code for the Kennedy wives was Rose Kennedy herself. Rose never spoke openly about Joe's infidelity. Instead, she would try to warn her daughters-in-law about what lay ahead, but she always framed it as practical advice about living life in the public eye. She told them they would hear scandalous gossip and accusations about their husbands, but that was because women chase politicians, and the only sensible response was to ignore it completely, unless they wanted to be very unhappy. It's not that she was lying exactly. It was the way she taught herself to see the situation, right? For her survival, and this is what I think she was trying to teach her daughters-in-law, she had to reframe that chronic betrayal as sort of an occupational hazard. And she had to position her silence about it as wisdom rather than surrender. What sustained Rose's composure, it seems, was a kind of self-constructed theology, one in which the Kennedy men occupied a position just below God, which meant that whatever they did was by definition not hers to question. It's the only framework that makes sense of her response to Jackie's stillbirth. She was sure that Jack knew what he was doing. If you place a man on a high enough pedestal, you never have to reckon with what he actually does. And any daughter-in-law who showed she was suffering threatened to drag the whole altar down. She once criticized Jackie for staying in bed after a difficult delivery, calling her spoiled and malingering, and pressuring her to come downstairs to join guests for lunch, despite Jackie's postpartum depression and doctor-ordered bed rest. Jackie ignored her completely.
Good for her.
Ethel Kennedy was Rose's most devoted devoted student. Rose was known to micromanage her daughters-in-law in practical terms, reminding them to get their husbands and kids to attend mass and keep the furniture out of direct sunlight. She apparently insisted they all adopt what she called the Sacred Heart way of sitting. It consisted in basically sitting up extremely straight with legs together, delicately crossed at the ankle. Apparently, crossing your legs at the knee is advertising indiscretion. Whatever Rose had to teach, Ethel absorbed the emotional doctrine wholesale. After a physically traumatic birth that left her in serious pain, she was so determined that none of the men see her struggling that she would put on a full face of makeup and a smile whenever Bobby entered the hospital room. Then she would collapse in tears the moment he left. After Robert's assassination, she never remarried. She simply redirected all of her effort into upholding the family. Upon Rose's death, it was Ethel who assumed the role of Kennedy matriarch, which is exactly what she was doing when she grilled Carolyn Bessette at that first dinner. But Ethel, to her credit, was considerably more human with Carolyn than Rose had ever been with any of her daughters-in-law. When the video of Carolyn and John's public fight surfaced, the one showing them shouting and being physically aggressive with each other, Ethel invited Carolyn for tea. According to a friend who accompanied her, what followed was some of the most genuinely useful advice Carolyn had ever received. Quote, "I finally got it that the only way to survive in this family is to look in the mirror every single morning and say, you know what? I am enough. Plain and simple. That's it. I am enough. Eventually it sinks in that yes, you are enough, and that no one can ever take that away from you, not even the Kennedys." End quote. It did help for a while. It made Carolyn a little more confident in handling the press. But the paparazzi situation never really stopped tormenting her, and it actually became one of the central fault lines in her marriage to John. Because John had spent his entire life being followed by cameras. He'd long since made his peace with it, but Carolyn had not, and the anxiety it produced was relentless. Anyone who's ever dealt with anxiety knows that once you're in the throes of it, it's really hard to see a situation clearly. When she tried to explain to him how she felt, he was dismissive. He told her it was no big deal, that she should learn to ignore them. And he wasn't being cruel. He genuinely couldn't understand. He believed he was trying to help her. But by many accounts, it was exactly that failure to understand her, that gap of empathy, that became one of the deepest and most persistent problems between them. So now we arrive at a basic, simple, obvious question. Why did these women stay? It's easy to reach for the obvious answer. The money, the status, the name. And yeah, those things were real. But as we've seen, they were never the whole story. And they always came with a price. The truth is that leaving wasn't really an option for most of these women, not in any practical sense. Divorce would have ended their husbands' political careers, and they knew it. Jackie understood with uncomfortable clarity that she held Jack's future in her hands, which was, of course, exactly the position that the family needed her and all of the other wives to be in. While Joe Sr. was the one who handled the political and financial architecture of it all, arranging marriages, negotiating settlements, making sure that the numbers worked in his son's favor, it was really Rose who provided the ideological scaffolding. By modeling what she seemed to genuinely believe was some kind of noble sacrifice, she gave the other women a framework that made the whole thing feel, if not exactly dignified, then at least like it had some kind of purpose. Right? Like they were sacrificing for something worthwhile. They were doing it for the family, for the political future of the Kennedy men. And there was no room to question if that was the right thing to do in the first place. And then their Catholic faith did the rest. In their world, a broken home wasn't just a personal failure, it was a moral failure. To leave their husbands was to deprive their children of their stability, their legacy, their place inside of a name that, whatever its private costs, still seemed to mean something in the world. And there was another factor too, one that often gets disregarded in hindsight because it does complicate the narrative, but which is essential to understanding this whole thing, and that is love. Despite everything, and I mean everything, we've just been through, these women were genuinely and deeply in love with their husbands. Ethel and Bobby were described by everyone who knew them as twin spirits, anchored by a shared faith, a mutual ferocity, and a bond that was described as being solid as steel. She provided him with the kind of unconditional love that he'd always longed for as a child. When asked to name his greatest achievement, Bobby didn't even hesitate. He just said, marrying Ethel. His sister Eunice said that he was the only one of her brothers that she truly believe wouldn't have been the man that he was without his wife. After his assassination, Ethel never removed her wedding ring. Even decades later, she was still using the term soulmates to describe them. By all accounts, she seemed to be really happy having Bobby at the center of her world. Now, if you ask me, do I think that that's a healthy or desirable relationship dynamic? No. But however imperfect, it was real for them. Now, Jackie was a little different. From the beginning, she really longed to establish her own identity separate from her husband, which, unlike most husbands of the era, Jack never actually begrudged her, provided that it didn't interfere with his political career, of course. She deeply admired him. They had a profound intellectual connection, and underneath it all, there was this kind of tacit mutual understanding. Jackie wasn't interested in being a traditional wife, and he obviously was never interested in being a traditional husband. It was almost as if she had decided, either consciously or not, probably not, that putting up with his Kennedy shenanigans was just the price she had to pay to be herself, which is really sad. I mean, no one should have to accept that, but it was what it was. And it was the same with Joan and Ted. Even with everything that Ted put her through, she still honestly believed that he was the only person that actually understood her. And Carolyn Bessette, when asked why she stayed despite the scrutiny and the pressure and the strain, apparently told her mother simply that she loved him. Their friends described her connection with John as being instant, mutual, and absolutely real. That they were soulmates who loved hard and fought hard with equal measure. I mean, John was ultimately captivated by the same candor that was so frowned upon in his family. By all accounts, underneath all the turbulence, they were apparently still enthralled with each other. None of that justifies what these marriages cost, mind you. But my point is that none of these decisions were made in a vacuum. Real love and real damage coexisted in the same relationships, often in the same moments. That's not a contradiction, that's just how it actually worked. Now, what the Kennedy family illustrates when you step back far enough is the same patriarchal system that all of us live under. It's a system that requires some people to make themselves smaller so that other people can remain at the top. The internal logic that ran the Kennedy household is the same logic that has always run institutions, economies, and empires. Consolidate power and ensure that everyone below you has more to lose by leaving than by staying. Women most obviously, but also anyone whose silence, labor, or suffering is load-bearing for the people above them. And these systems don't sustain themselves by brute force alone. They sustain themselves by convincing the people they harm that the arrangement is natural, inevitable, even sacred, that suffering is noble, that loyalty means love, and that the house of cards is a home worth protecting, even at the cost of yourself. Now, in this story, religion did a great deal of that work. Not because faith is inherently oppressive, but because if you genuinely believe that God intended you to be in that role of subjugation, and that belief brings you real comfort, then there is very little incentive to question any of it. It's comfortable, it's what you know. The Kennedy women's Catholicism wasn't incidental to their endurance of this horrible situation. It was structural. It was the reason why Rose could send her daughters-in-law back to marriages that were destroying them while still feeling like she was doing something useful for them. And the longer a system like this runs, the higher the cost of dismantling it. Because to walk away is to collapse everyone else's arrangement too. And the price of that, social, financial, psychological, it can feel unsurmountable. So the coping mechanism that most people arrive at is the same one that these women arrived at, which is to lean in, make meaning of the situation rather than try to escape it. And for the longest time, that was Jackie's approach too. Only a few months after JFK's assassination, she gave an interview to historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and it shows exactly what that looked like from the inside.
But I mean, in my marriage, I could never conceive, and I remember I said it in an interview once, and all these women, we got all these irate letters. Someone said, "Where do you get your opinions?" And I said, "I get all my opinions from my husband," which is true. How could I have any political opinions? His were going to be the best. And I could never conceive of not voting for whoever my husband was for. Anyone who I'd be married to, I suppose if I was married to. So that was just so strange, because it was really rather terribly Victorian or Asiatic relationship which we had, which I thought
the Japanese wife.
Yeah, which I think's the best.
Now, her grief was clearly shaping how she remembered and reframed things. But what's striking to me is how hard she's working to validate those positions as being genuinely her own, to make them feel like a choice, not an imposition. Later in the 1970s, long after her life as a Kennedy had receded, Jackie came to see things a little differently. She even told a friend that she realized she couldn't live primarily through a husband. She built her own career as an editor and her own financial independence so that she would never have to marry for security again. But in that 1964 interview, still in the thick of her trauma and grief, it was Jackie leaning into the myth that cemented it permanently. Around that same time, she gave an interview to Life magazine where she mentioned that Jack's favorite Broadway musical was Camelot, and the image took hold immediately and never let go. It recast his short and complicated presidency into a legend and essentially transformed public grief into devotion to an ideal, sealing something into the American imagination that has never fully dissolved. Now, she didn't do that strategically, she did it to survive, but the effect was hugely consequential. So much of what made JFK iconic for so long was built on foundations laid by Jackie. Though the Kennedys had laughed at her quiche and her white wine, and Joe Sr. worried that her sophistication might be a political liability, it was Jackie's authenticity, it was her refusal to disappear into the role, and her insistence in remaining recognizably herself that the public really responded to, again and again across decades. She survived the Kennedy family by remaining stubbornly and irreducibly Jackie. And in doing so, she gave the myth more power than any of them could have managed alone. Rose was the one who perfected the image of the ideal American family and trained everyone around her to maintain it, whatever the price. Ethel absorbed the ethos so completely that she eventually became its enforcer. Joan and Carolyn paid with their mental health and their sense of self. Jackie had her ankle broken, her privacy shattered, and her grief bought off with a check. And she still took the most traumatic moment of her life and transmuted it into the family's most powerful cultural asset, Camelot. My point is, they all paid some kind of price, all in the name of maintaining this political dynasty. And yet, the Kennedy political dynasty is long gone by now, a relic of a world that no longer exists. Its particular brand of power as dated as the man who wielded it. Ironically, the most enduring thing about the Kennedys is the fascination that people still have with them. And at the center of that fascination are the very women who were never supposed to be the protagonists in the first place. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving us a like and a subscribe, and here's my Kennedy playlist for you. Binge away!